Mary Flowers, and I'm here on behalf of the Coalition for a Clean CFAC, and we're delighted that you've come this evening. We are looking forward to your feedback and your input, so we're going to kind of talk at you and show you some slides to start with, but then we're going to break out into some small group sessions where you can, as a group, report back to us some of the things that you thought were important that you heard tonight, some of the things that you have questions about, some of the things you'd like us to spend a little more time looking at, because what we're sharing with you tonight is some of our tentative findings, and they're tentative in the sense that we want to really bolster our findings and our position by knowing what the feedback is from the community, and that's really important to us to speak with a collective voice and to honor the feedback that we hear as well. So let me introduce our coalition members. Shirley Folkman is sitting at the table. You met her when you came in. Let's see, Del Phipps right here. Where is Phil? Phil's in the back there.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
And we have a couple of people who aren't here. I'm not missing anybody right now, am I? Okay. You have to bear with me. I had some cataract surgery recently, and I'm going back and forth between what I can see and what I can't see. So, the restrooms are out of this back double door here, and those should be unlocked, I think. And we also have some water up front here if you want it. We are asking, because we are a political society and issues get controversial, but we're asking, and I don't think we need to, but we're just reminding everyone to use civil dialogue and respect that there may be people here who share your opinion or who don't share your opinion, and it's important for us to hear from everyone. I do want to take a minute to introduce, we do have some agency folks here, and what we are going to do tonight is to ask the agency and Glencore representatives who are here tonight to be listeners in the process. We want to give the community time to ask questions and to discuss the issues. But we want to point out who the agency folks who are here tonight, so that at the end of the meeting, if you have questions that we haven't answered that you want to go ask them, we encourage you to do so. So Dick, you want to raise your hand or stand up?
Dick Sloan with Montana DEQ. I appreciate being here and looking forward to listening. Thank you.
Did Matt come in yet? No?
He won't make it.
Oh, he's not going to make it? Okay. You're going to hear from CFAC here in just a minute, but do you want to just introduce yourself briefly?
This is Sasha Nafi from Region 8, Technical Assistant Coordinator.
And then we have a representative from Big Sky Publications that also works for Glencore.
I am Dawn May. I work with Christine, who works with Glencore, so we work with Big Sky Public Relations.
Okay.
I'm also a resident of Big Fork, so I'm here personally.
And we welcome you being here, and we appreciate that. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I want folks to know who's here if they have questions. Am I missing any other agency representatives? Okay. So the first thing we're going to do tonight is I want to give CFAC a minute to speak to you. We have applied for what is called a TAG grant, and the TAG grant will help us as we move forward to hire some independent consultants and help us be directly engaged in hearings going forward in terms of design features or helping us to be able to be actively participating in that process. I do want to introduce Carmen King. I didn't do that. Carmen King is currently working with us, and Dave, through a separate grant process called the TASK grant, and they have been invaluable to us in helping us there's 10,000 pages, or I don't even know how many pages, but huge amounts of documentation on this site. And they've helped us find information and understand what it says. They will not be able to tell you the community should do this or the community shouldn't do that. That's for us to decide, but it's been really helpful to know how to access the information that helps inform us. So, Cisse, can I turn the mic over to you for a minute to talk about the TAG grant, and you can probably explain it without my having to do that for you.
I got you. Yeah, my name is Cisse Shanafi. I'm from the Denver office, technical assistant coordinator. As was mentioned, we currently have SKIO that is providing technical assistance service for communities. That is a contract that the EPA provides to make sure that the community members that are impacted by the Superfund site understand what is currently going on and can be able to provide informed comments to the agencies involved in making the decision. Recently, the Coalition for Clean CFAC applied for a technical assistance grant. We are in the process of reviewing that application, and we're hoping that in the next month we will provide a grant to the coalition to be able to do a similar type of work as the contract, but instead of the EPA being able to manage the contract, the community with the Coalition for Clean CFAC is going to be able to hire their own independent technical advisor that is going to be able to provide them feedback as to what is in the Superfund documents. I had a great discussion earlier today with the coalition. Once we receive an application, it is normal for us to kind of have a meeting with the applicant to go over expectations so that we don't run into any problems once the grant is provided. So it's a normal procedure. But I also found out that there is this public meeting going on, so I wanted to introduce myself to the larger audience and also make myself available if there are any questions related to the grant, how you guys can use the resources that is provided to the coalition. Obviously, even without the grant being available, the coalition has been working with the community to provide this kind of dialogue in terms of what is going on with the CFAC site. So they're going to be able to continue that work once the grant is being provided. They're going to even continue to do at a bigger stage. So I wanted to thank the coalition for the dedication that they have, and then the EPA will do its best to make the grant available as soon as possible when the application is fully submitted. I won't be around for too long, but I did leave my contact with the coalition, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I'll be happy to answer any questions related to the grant or the contract. Thank you.
Thank you. So you should have on your tables a copy of the slideshow that we're going to walk through now. I encourage you to kind of follow along with that. And if there are questions that you have about a slide, maybe jot them down, something we haven't answered. We're going to ask that you hold questions until we'll take a short break between speakers, enough to take a couple of really direct questions about a slide. But then we want you to hold most of your questions and discussions until the final part of the program tonight. I'm going to start by introducing Del Phipps, who's going to start us off tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Del Phipps, and I'll be presenting.
I don't think it's
Wrap in your face. Yeah, it's on. You just gotta.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, really close to your mouth.
I'm Del Phipps. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. I'll try. Thank Thank you for joining us tonight for our second deep dive into the proposed CFAC cleanup plan. What we'll cover tonight will be look closer at the findings we discussed at our August community meeting, the pros and cons of a slurry wall and an on-site hazardous waste landfill, the types of modifications to alternative remedial alternatives, ecological risks to Flathead River and Flathead Lake, how EPA evaluates remedial alternatives. That's the scoring and ranking of the different options that are being considered, and community questions and concerns. And then we pretty much already covered the role of our technical assistant consultant, Carmen King, who will be available for questions also. Mary covered our general guidelines, so feel free to ask some quick questions after each of our presentations, but hold anything more than a few quick questions till afterwards, please. So now I'll go over the summary of the findings that were presented at the September community meeting. While off-site removal of the most hazardous waste to a hazardous waste landfill is what we initially were asking for, our research has found that on-site consolidation of the most hazardous waste into a RCRA-approved hazardous waste landfill provides similar effectiveness. It is much more protective in the long term than the slurry wall. Additional sampling is needed within and under the west and wet scrubber sludge pond landfills to determine an accurate volume of waste that needs to be removed. There's no data to support slurry wall effectiveness in the long term. It's a relatively new technology. Slurry walls can and do fail. The unique geology of this site adds to its uncertainty. Excavating the hazardous waste material does have safety issues, including the possibility of explosions. By using modern safety measures, much of this waste can be safely removed. This hazardous waste is reactive when in contact with water. All of the source material and much of the underlying contaminated soil is above the high groundwater level. This minimizes the reactivity and explosive nature of the waste, making it easier to excavate. This map depicts within the 1,340 acres shown within the black outermost line, which is classified as the CFAC Superfund site. The Flathead River is at the bottom of the slide, and Aluminum City is to the far left. Much of the focus of our studies is on the two landfills shown in yellow in the middle of the slide. These landfills are the West Landfill and the Wet Scrubber Sludge Pond Landfill. These two landfills contain the majority of the most hazardous waste on this site. EPA's current proposed plan calls for constructing a slurry wall around these two landfills to contain the hazardous waste within its boundaries. This picture shows how a slurry wall is constructed. An excavator digs a trench approximately 3 foot in width and however deep is needed to tie it into a confining layer. Equipment takes the extracted soil and mixes it with bentonite, which consists of clay and minerals, creating a slurry that is backfilled into the trench. Note the keying material in the lower dark layer. For a slurry wall to be effective, it must fully tie into this layer, keeping water and contaminants from escaping. The slurry wall is designed to keep contaminants confined on the slides by the slurry wall and at the bottom with the confining layer. The top of the landfill is sealed with a protective cap at the very end of construction. Next, I'll speak about the advantages and disadvantages of slurry walls. So slurry walls, the advantages are that they are used to contain large amounts of hazardous waste that are considered too difficult to remove or treat using other methods. Has low permeability, meaning that water and contaminants can travel through it, but at a very, very slow rate. Minimal sloping and shoring of the excavation site, so you don't have to dig a bigger area to protect the people working in it. Minimal cost when compared to other alternatives, and shorter time frame to complete, approximately taking 2 construction seasons. Disadvantages of a slurry wall. Contaminants can escape if the slurry wall is not completely keyed into a solid barrier at the bottom of the wall. Contaminants can escape through the wall on the sides if boulders shift once the wall is in place. Strict quality control measures must be used to ensure flaws in the construction don't occur, which can affect its performance. Physical factors such as seismic activity, extreme flooding, drying events, and pressure buildup may cause slurry walls to lose their containment capacity, has the potential to degrade or deteriorate over time. Slurry walls have only been used since the early 80s. Long-term performance has not been established. Rowe, the company CFAC used for its studies, put out a fact sheet in August of 2023. The fact sheet states Rowe conducted 5-year reviews of 48 Superfund sites where slurry walls were installed. Of the 48 sites, only 36 were considered effective by US EPA standards. 1/4 of the sites did not function as designed in the record of decision when considering short and long-term protectiveness. Installation of a 3,800 foot long slurry wall to a depth of 100, I need to start over. ERCO, the company that is responsible for approximately 1/3 of the cleanup cost, issued a letter to the US EPA on August 23rd of 2023. I list some of the concerns about the proposed slurry wall for you on this slide. Installation of a 3,800 foot long slurry wall to a depth of 130 feet in this area has significant implementability issues. The presence of loose cobbles and boulders will make it very difficult to install a deep slurry wall. Constructing an effective slurry wall under these conditions will be extremely challenging and may be technically impracticable. Had the real potential for slurry wall defects been adequately considered in the detailed assessment of effectiveness, this option would have scored much lower. At a similar site to the CFAC site in Meade, Washington, where a proposed slurry wall was removed from consideration because its implementability was designated as being unlikely, unproven at required depths. And those depths are very similar to the depths at the CFAC site.
Bill, who wrote the summary?
So this is ARCO. They are one of the responsible parties for the site. So it's ARCO is responsible for approximately 1/3 of the cost, and Glencore is responsible for the remainder. So ARCO, during their proposed, when they were reviewing the draft feasibility study, these were the comments they made to EPA. They didn't want to see the slurry wall. From what I was told, that ARCO wanted something less than a slurry wall. That was their reasoning for making these comments. Okay. So this slide shows the 11 different slurry walls that the EPA used as comparison of a proposed slurry wall for the CFAC site. So this is what they provided at one of their recent community meetings to provide similar comparisons to what they're proposing for the CFAC site. EPA stated that the OK Tool Company Superfund site, where I placed the arrow, was most similar to the CFAC site pertaining to geological features and contamination concerns. The New Hampshire site lists VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, and metals as their primary pollutants. The CFAC site has spent pot liner and wet scrubber sludge containing cyanide and fluoride as its primary pollutants. Another difference is that the New Hampshire site lists 100 feet as its maximum depth. The CFAC site will need to reach depths up to 150 feet deep. The New Hampshire site lists bedrock as the material the slurry wall tied into at the bottom. The CFAC site only has an aquitard to tie into. Aquitards are subsurface layers of sediment placed there by nature and can be quite inconsistent in their makeup. They consist of clay, sand, and other fine particles. Aquitards are much less desirable to tie into than bedrock. As you can see, there are no existing sites that provide meaningful comparison. This alternative, if utilized, will serve as an experiment and pushes the boundaries of this type of technology. This image depicts the geology beneath the Flathead Valley. It shows how the aquitard, which is shown in brown, I'll point to that here. So this is the aquitard that's being depicted here. This is the water flowing underground, the groundwater. We have a shallow aquifer and a deep aquifer. This is Tea Kettle Mountain, and this consists of bedrock, and then bedrock is down here. The slurry wall would tie into the aquitard, which is up here. As you can see, there are inconsistencies in it.
And I would just point out, in Columbia Falls, we sit above one of the deepest parts of the aquifer. You'd have to go down 3,000 feet to hit that bedrock here in Columbia Falls.
So the aquitards are considered semi-permeable. Bedrock consists of solid rock and is impermeable. Bedrock is shown in gray at the bottom. Tea Kettle Mountain is the bedrock feature to the right. Now I would like to discuss the pros and cons of another alternative, an on-site hazardous waste landfill, which is much more secure and protective than a slurry wall. This alternative made it on EPA's top 6 alternatives and was ranked the highest of all alternatives for long-term effectiveness and permanence. So it ranked of all of the 6 highest, it ranked the highest for long-term effectiveness and permanence. These landfills are designed to last for centuries. One important feature of this alternative is that it sits above all groundwater. If the hazardous waste is kept away from water, it cannot travel to other locations. So this is the federal requirements for designing a hazardous waste landfill. It must have a double liner, double leachate collection and removal systems, which I'll describe more in a minute. Leak detection system, runoff, run-on, and wind dispersal controls, constructed using quality assurance programs. Operators, the ones that will be taking care of it after it's built, must comply with inspection, monitoring, and release response requirements. Since landfills are permanent disposal sites and are closed with waste in place, they are subject to closure and post-closure requirements. Those include installing and maintaining a final cover, continuing operation of the leachate collection and removal system, until leachate is no longer detected. Did it. Sorry about that.
Do you have just a quick question?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
How many of these proposed, liners have been used on Superfund sites before, and how repeatable are they? Like, what's the rate of success?
For these liners, so I talk a little bit about that in the next slide, but they are very thick and they are designed, each site is designed for its unique features. And I've read that they can be designed to last upward of 1,000 years.
So there's no defects and there's never a problem you come across?
So,
You're welcome to ask Carmen some of that too after the end. She might be able to speak to that more from her broader experience.
So there would be groundwater monitoring, preventing storm water from running on and off, and installing and surveying benchmarks. Speed fencing and perimeters if needed. So this is a slide that shows how the different types of liners are within a hazardous waste landfill. And right here's where the waste would be placed. All of this is the protection underneath and on the sides. And once all the waste is put in place, then this would be the cover that goes on top. I'll read to you a little bit about that. Each hazardous waste landfill is designed specifically for its unique characteristics. It must provide protection within the geology it will be built and contain the specific types of hazardous waste placed in it. The design shown here utilizes thick clay liners above and below the waste material. Thick, high-density polyethylene geomembrane liners are placed above and below the waste material. 2 drainage layers are installed under the waste that collects leachate and any moisture within the cell. Leachate is liquid waste that flows through landfill waste and collects below it. Leachate is extracted and removed off-site. As you can see, this containment method has much more protection in place than a slurry well does. One of the issues CFAC and the EPA described as drawbacks when considering alternatives such as an on-site hazardous waste landfill is that in order to remove all the pollutants in the soil beneath the existing landfills, the soil would have to be removed to depths upwards of 50 feet. A way to address this issue is to relocate the most highly concentrated soils into the hazardous waste landfill and install extraction wells down gradient. So this would be the location where they're excavating and removing the hazardous waste to be removed somewhere else. At lower elevations, it gets more and more difficult to remove, more expensive, and the concentrations may be much less down there. So a way of dealing with the residual contaminants is to install extraction wells, which are right here. So the contaminants that would leach into the groundwater would be drawn in through these extraction wells, place it into a holding tank, and then go through treatment, water treatment, filtration. And then the treated water would pass through and could be put into percolation ponds or could be re-injected into the groundwater. And contaminants will be captured within these treatment trains. This treatment would continue until water sampling shows that the residual contaminants in the lower soil layers have been removed and no longer pose a risk. So what are the advantages of an on-site hazardous waste landfill? It's most protective of all on-site alternatives. has scored the highest by EPA for long-term effectiveness. It's built to last for centuries, self-contained with leach detection systems, keeps hazardous waste away from groundwater and surface water, which is the precipitation, and stops contaminants from traveling elsewhere. It's much less costly than off-site disposal. And since design is very protective in the long term, more land reuse options are available, providing a safer location for future housing and other land uses. So what are some of the concerns and considerations associated with the hazardous waste landfill? The cost is estimated to be $166 million compared to $58 million for a slurry wall and on-site consolidation. Requires excavating the hazardous waste and relocating it to a new on-site location, potentially exposing workers to risks. I did want to note that both the slurry wall and on-site hazardous landfill alternatives subject workers to these risks, and that there are modern safety procedures that can be put in place to address these risks. It requires a quality control construction plan that minimizes rainwater from entering the new hazardous waste landfill during construction. And it could increase groundwater contamination under the current landfills in the short term if rainfall entering the excavation site leaches contaminants to deeper levels. Design plans utilizing groundwater extraction and treatment, as described in the previous slide, can be used to address this issue.
I was just gonna add on this cost, one of the things that isn't figured into this 58 million is if there is a failure of the slurry wall and the replacement cost. If that is looked at more long-term, that could be a much higher figure.
Next, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Carmen. Oh, sorry, thank you. So before we go to Carmen, are there any quick questions that you would, I'm sorry. Are there any quick questions you'd like to have addressed before we move on?
I was wondering, in the last presentation, sometime in the summer, there was a question about monitoring. So is this monitoring, is it equivalent to the monitoring that was planned? So the same, it would be a different process, but would the same cost in long-term monitoring be?
For an on-site landfill versus a slurry wall? There would be monitoring associated with that. There's groundwater monitoring. Talked about the different steps that the workers that would be taking care of it would have to follow, ensuring that that cover stays protected on the top. They'd be monitoring the groundwater around and down gradient from it. Test it, making.
So is that similar to the cost and longevity of the slurry wall monitoring?
And Carmen, I don't know if that's something you can speak to. We haven't seen actual figures on that. That is something that would be a good question for us to follow up with and see if we can find more about those costs. But
Yeah, that is a good question. I would guess that the monitoring would be similar between these two alternatives, because as Dell pointed out, if you install a landfill, you want to maintain the integrity of the cap and all the components associated with the landfill. Well, the same holds true with the slurry walls. You've got to monitor and maintain the integrity of the slurry walls, so that aspect will be consistent. And then there's additional monitoring to test the effectiveness of the overall remedy, period. So that would be similar. So I don't know if monitoring necessarily would be a cost difference between these two alternatives. I bet they would be somewhat similar.
good question though. Thank you.
Are there any other quick questions? Yes.
Two questions. Has a location been proposed for the haz waste landfill? And what's the size of the footprint of the haz waste landfill?
That's a great question. I know in our last presentation, we had a
Bill,
slide.
excuse me, could you repeat the question? So
Oh,
everybody,
sure.
please.
So you had asked if there's been a proposed location for the new hazardous waste landfill. The remedial investigation, they did propose a location. They considered this and made it to the top of their top 6 alternatives. And where they described it, it would sit right next to the existing landfills that'd be excavated just below them. That site may change some if they were to go with this. They would do further studies to determine to make sure that that is the best location, but that's what it was initially described as being located. And I believe I read that they're anticipating that the footprint of it would be around 43 acres and approximately 20 feet deep to contain all that material. And I would like to mention that there are possibilities to reuse the land on that footprint once the hazardous waste landfill is placed there. So it can be reused, and they are often reused throughout the country. And the site that's being excavated, where if it was to be a slurry wall, that would be designated as off limits for everyone forever. Where once that material is excavated, that would allow that land to be reused also. Any other questions?
Would all the different hazardous materials be mixed into one landfill site, or would there be separate landfills for separate materials that are not good to mix together?
So, the current proposed the alternative, when they were looking at that, they described it as taking all that material and placing it in there. There would be some, what's called pre-treatment, where any material that is liquefied, they would do some stuff to solidify it, but it would all be removed and just placed in this new hazardous waste landfill, kind of compacted in there all together.
In the handout that you got of the slides, at the very end, there's links to 2 videos. One of them was playing at the beginning, showing what a hazardous waste landfill is. The second one talks about pre-treatment and how that is handled at a hazardous waste landfill.
So all the waste has to be solid that goes in there. So if it's in a liquid state, there would be some process to add some things to it to get it to be more solid. Yes.
Okay.
Uh,
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
What is the specific contaminant that is reactive to water?
So cyanide is the main contaminant that's, we're dealing with huge amounts of cyanide with it. There's also fluoride, but cyanide and fluoride are the 2 main contaminants.
And that explodes when it contacts water, is that what you're saying?
So cyanide has the potential to be explosive. If it associates with water, it becomes hydrogen cyanide, and then that hydrogen cyanide, when it comes in contact with the air in certain temperatures and conditions, have the potential to explode. So there would have to be safety plans put in place to deal with that aspect.
Yeah, let's keep moving.
Okay, channel change. Can everybody hear me? Yep, okay, good, because I have a terrible voice. Well, hello, while we're trying to find, I've got 2 slides to present, which isn't much information, but again, I'm Carmen King with the Technical Assistance Services for Communities program, and I've been helping the CCC for a bit of time now. The whole point of my job is to basically act as a technical liaison to help communities such as yourself understand these very complicated processes associated with the Superfund site. Myself in particular, I've worked on Superfund sites for close to 35 years now. And so I've got some familiarity with sites with similar issues and sites across the country. So any questions, throw them at me. I'd love to help you. And I am also similar to yourselves, I live within the footprint of 2 Superfund sites myself, so that kind of lends to my trying to understand and sympathize with your questions and issues. But real quick, channel change. Dell did a beautiful job talking about the alternatives and the physics behind them. I'm going to be talking about critters, wildlife, my favorite topic. There were questions the last meeting held that a lot of the community folks are very concerned about the wildlife, about the critters associated with the Superfund site and the possible impacts to the critters. I mean, you have a beautiful, wonderful natural setting. This is Montana. We want to make sure that any cleanup that happens, there's no further disturbance to the things we love, and that tends to be the critters. So what you're looking at up here is the process of Superfund. It looks like a step-by-step, phase-by-phase. It is a scientific process where we start investigative studies to understand what is the contamination, where is the contamination, how much exists, and what are the next steps we need to take to basically deal with that contamination to protect human health and ecological life. That red box right in the middle is what is called the remedial investigation phase, the RI phase, which we are well past in regard to CFAC. But during the RI phase, which is the scientific studies, where a ton of scientists like myself are unleashed out onto CFAC, we go out there and we sample everything that's moving and not moving, put it into sample jars, chuck it into the lab, get all the analysis back that tells us the contamination. It'll tell us where the contamination is. Yay! We have a mountain of data. So what? The next so what question is, what does that mean? I was just helping a community person a few minutes ago. We have all this data that tells us about the contamination, meaning we have an understanding of the concentrations of things like hydrogen cyanide. But to understand how it affects human health and ecological life is we implement tools called risk assessment. We take all that data, we evaluate the information to determine is the concentrations of contaminants, are they at concentrations that are going to cause harm? And that whole process is risk assessment. So a baseline ecological risk assessment was completed for CFAC. It is a 2,000-page document. I've got 2 slides, I'm going to finish it, trust me. It is huge, and it is a scientific study to evaluate the contamination associated with the site now and potentially in the future to understand what is going to be the harm to ecological life. So that is the process. It is a very important component to Superfund because the answers to those questions, is there harm to ecological life, help us design remedies to control that harm. Okay? That's the point we're trying to get to. We want to understand where the contamination is, where are the problems, and what we need to do about it. This is just a slice of one of the answers that that document provides. It is a very complicated document. Like I said, it's 2,000 pages long because what it tries to do is address the universe of impacts that CFAC has created to ecological life. So let's think about what is ecological life. Well, it's everything, right? Everything from bugs, bunnies, and birds to the aquatic life in the Flathead River. We're worried about the bugs and the aquatic life, like fish and the plants and everything. All of those pieces to the ecological pie are very important. None of those critters can live without the other critters. So even the presence of aquatic bugs is just as important as the presence of fish. So the ecological risk assessment serves to address what is the risk to every aspect of ecological life. It's very complicated and it's a very long document. If you get a chance to trudge through it, it is volume 7 of the RI. It is a public document on the site profile EPA page. You will see a bunch of figures such as this that breaks down the CFAC site by habitat, by critters, by contamination, by exposure. It literally pulls the site apart into a puzzle to understand the impacts to all forms of life by area. The point is, at the end of all of that, to find the hot spots, the problem areas. That is where we focus the remedy. So like I said, baseline ecological risk assessment, what it did was to outline where is ecological risk. The results of that are used to design where the remedy is put into place to address that. 2 slides. 2,000 pages. All right, any questions? And I'm around, I am your point of contact. I'm here for the community. So if you've got any questions, I'm yours to reach out. Thank you.
It's Phil.
Yeah. So Phil Manton is going to take us through a little bit more of the findings that taking the information that Carmen's helped us identify, and drawing some conclusions from that.
No questions for Carmen?
Oh, sure, just to not leave her out.
Please
As
go
with
ahead.
scientific studies, is there a conclusion that you guys reach in these type of studies as to the, relativity of the toxicity of the site?
The relativity of the toxicity
You've
overall?
worked with Superfund sites for
Yeah.
many years.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
relative to the ones you see in New Jersey, this, that, and the other thing, what are we looking at? Is there a conclusion or an abstract to that report that says, hey, wow, not so bad, or wow, you guys are really in trouble?
Everything in between. There's some not so bads and there's some ringers. There's hotspots that were addressed that did show, yeah, we got some issues, and then there's other areas that blended into background. It looks like everything else in Montana. It's all spectrums because all spectrums were evaluated. Literally the risk to a deer was evaluated, a risk to an earthworm was evaluated. Certain spots, earthworms are gonna have a problem, other spots no. So, yeah, literally the conclusions run the spectrum because there were so many conclusions to be drawn. All the list of critters that we looked at, all the different habitats that we looked at. Yes?
Have there been any like standout risks to like certain wildlife species, like especially like grizzly bears or wolves or something?
Oh, none of the big ones, which is really nice, and that's very common. I'm an ecological risk assessor, but
Right.
because those critters, they're integrators, right? They have huge habitat areas required for their life history, and so
Yeah.
their exposure to a given hotspot is pretty rare.
Right.
Where we tend to see risk is the critters that have small life history areas, and birds tend to be the drivers, to be honest with you. They're very, very sensitive. They don't have metabolism to deal with a whole lot of contaminants, and so I've seen birds be the driver for a lot of ecological risk issues. Mammals have a lot of tolerance, which is surprising.
Right.
Plants, we have what's really called a phytotoxic barrier. It's kind of interesting. When you have contamination in soil, the first things to be impacted tend to be plants, and that's almost an environmental buffer, because if plants die, then the critters that eat the plants leave, and so they're not going to be exposed, and on and on and on. So it's called a phytotoxic barrier. That, yes, it's unfortunate we killed the plants, but the environment's kind of like saying, well, everything else is going to leave as a result. So you have like this protective capacity. So plants were evaluated, and some soil conditions were definitely found that led to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons being a contaminant of concern in certain soil areas, and that is going to be scooped and moved and tucked away as a result. It was a very fast answer. Did that help? Okay. Yes.
Just had a question, the 2,000-page document you were referring to, did you say that was volume 7?
I think it's volume 7 of the RI. So if you look on the site profile page
Of the RI?
of the RI, the remedial investigation.
Okay. And, so you could find specifics of everything you're
Oh,
talking about?
yeah.
Even,
Yes.
so,
Yeah, it's 2,000 pages
right, there's
because,
probably a table of contents. if you
oh
want.
yeah. Yeah, it's got something like 8 appendices associated with it, and it's a very robust document, gives you the data associated with it, so it's a lot of information.
On the EPA site page, it's the 6th page in of related documents is when it starts. I only know because we've downloaded them like 100 times, so, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Okay, so we really appreciate y'all coming out tonight. We really appreciate Carmen and Dave for helping us through the task. We have a lot of questions before this, we have a lot of questions now, but they're really helping us fight through it, and Seaside, who is out here, is gonna help us explore that a little further through the task grant. But it's clear that there's a rather large volume of groundwater that's not adequately, being addressed through the slurry wall alone. It's been well documented that groundwater contaminated with site-related cyanide, fluoride, PHAs, heavy metals, and whatnot are leaching into the Flathead River via seeps at or near the transitional and aquatic exposure areas and concentrations posing ecological concern. And so the areas I'm talking about are right here along the river. This is the backwater seep area. This is the Flathead riparian area channel, and this is the south percolation ponds. These habitats within these areas vary from aquatic to terrestrial depending on seasonal and spatial variations, and they're very important for a slew of biota ranging from the mammals that we talked about, birds, semi-aquatic birds, aquatic plants, benthic invertebrates, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. So according to the BERA, or the Baseline Ecological Risk Assessment, risk estimates indicate that a high exposure of these contaminants lie in sediment, pore water, and surface water associated with the backwater areas, the Flathead riparian areas, and the south percolation ponds, with risk to benthic invertebrates being of primary concern. So benthic invertebrates are the little stoneflies, they're the little bugs that crawl around underneath the riverine systems, in through the rocks. They come out into the land. They could be clams, worms, you name it, but essentially it's fish food, basically, that's inside the water. These organisms are a very important food source for many fish, including recreationally and commercially important species. The greatest surface water concentrations of total cyanide and fluoride, these contaminants of concern, are generally observed at the sampling site 005. And that's this pink dot right up there. I suppose I could use the cursor, but I don't really know how to use the cursor. My apologies. I'm here for entertainment as well as information. Bear with me. But the BERA noted that the high concentrations of the contaminants there at that site occur usually when the discharge in the river is low, suggesting that the potential exposure of these contaminants is greatest during low flow periods. Okay, so think fall and winter. Now, discharge of cyanide and fluoride in particular into the groundwater has been authorized by MDEQ from 1994 to 2019. The statement of basis justifying this permit noted that cyanide is not persistent in surface water due to its volatilization, or its ability to break down. The discharge would have no effect on fish migration in the river. There are no fish spawning or nursery areas in the backwater channel, and that there are no anticipated impacts on aquatic life. However, we know that backwaters are indeed important habitat for fish, including the federally threatened bull trout and the West Slope cutthroat trout, a sensitive species, or a species of concern for Montana. And it's well known that young juvenile bull trout enter still or slow moving water, such as these backwater areas, to achieve rapid growth and energy source. So basically, the juvenile bull trout leave the higher velocity streams and they enter these backwaters to get some rest. One study by the USGS found that these shallow areas along the channel migrations or margins provide critical habitat for overwintering subadult bull trout. Now recall when I mentioned the sampling results at that station 005 suggested potential exposure is highest during low flow periods, such as the winter. So lo and behold, these juvenile bull trout are using these shallow areas in the winter when the contamination is higher risk for them. The same study shows that subadult bull trout, or the juveniles, exploit these shallow habitats, presumably for feeding. Now, bull trout are opportunistic feeders. They prey upon other organisms within the aquatic realm. Juvenile bull trout prey on terrestrial and aquatic insects, macro zooplankton, and other small fish, while adult bull trout primarily feed exclusively on other fish. An abundant food chain, or food base, is very important for individual and population health. And some of the threats facing the bull trout include habitat degradation and poor water quality. Some of the same threats that face their food. So the BARA states that contaminants in the groundwater discharged to surface water can remain in dissolved form, or they could absorb or stick to suspended particles and other fine-grained sediments, thus influencing their bioavailability and potential for ecological risks within the food chain. So basically, these little benthic invertebrates are crawling around within the sand and on the gravel and the cobble. They're exposed to the contaminants that are in the periphyton growing on the rocks. They eat that stuff, it gets absorbed in their tissues, or they are exposed to it through direct contact. And then the carnivore or the predators that feed upon them might get this bioaccumulated within their own tissue. And so up the food chain it goes. Another threat is direct contact. So think about fish gills. Fish gills are kind of sensitive, you know. It doesn't take a whole lot of contaminants to wreak havoc on those guys. Now, I usually don't read straight from slides, but I'm going to take the liberty here on the next few, just reading basically the bulk. So, samples were collected specifically to more fully characterize the impacts on the Flathead River. And we're talking within this riparian zone along the river area. Data from these samples were not included in the food chain model. Thus, ingestion risk estimates were not developed for the Flathead River riparian area channel. I don't know.
2,000 pages.
Okay, so the data was collected, but it wasn't used. And the ingestion risks were not developed. The BARA further goes on to say data in the Flathead River riparian channel indicate the potential for adverse effects due to the exposure, potential input from this shallow water that's seeping in to the river channel through the seeps appears to be an ongoing pathway to poor water within the river channel. And there is uncertainty and potential chronic direct contact effects. What happened to my slide here? You cut us off a little bit, but does that say in your printouts there? Mm-hmm. What can we do about that, Dave?
I think it's just too far down the page.
I'm sure there's nothing important on that slide. So basically, the contaminated groundwater is continually seeping in these areas down into the Flathead River.
Yeah, it's just too many words for the slide.
Too many words for the slide. I thought you checked these, Mary. So anyway, groundwater is flowing into the Flathead River via these seeps, and that's groundwater is contaminated. The bearer goes on to say, ecological risk associated with direct contact was considered moderate. So they own up to the fact that, yeah, there's a big threat out there for these guys. Further evaluation may be warranted. And even on EPA's own website, they acknowledge the fact that with limited amount of data captured as part of the sampling events, it is unknown if bioaccumulation of these contaminants is a concern. And they didn't sample the fish, and I don't believe they sampled the benthic invertebrates either. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen any data that supports that. So they don't know if this stuff is actually going up the food chain. But they admit that it is a continuing threat through the groundwater. So, I mean, this basically begs the question, how long will these contaminants remain in the water, in the groundwater? So, they ran a couple groundwater flux scenarios, basically saying, how long would it take for the groundwater to achieve remedial action objectives? So basically, how long is it gonna take for the groundwater to, the contamination of the cyanide, for example, to fall within the Montana standards?
And so that conclusion was based on a slurry wall as a
Yes.
solution.
Right, I'm getting that, thank you. So this is all prefaced by the fact that we control the source of contamination. In this case, they built a slurry wall. They contain the source material. The groundwater moves away from there. They're assuming that there's no more groundwater infiltrating the source. There's no more groundwater leaching out of that slurry wall. It's going to, in the first example, the scenario up there, it could take between 14 to 26 years to them to achieve their remedial action objectives. In the second scenario, and again, it's just controlling the source, it's not treating the source, it's not dealing with the source, it's just the groundwater. It could take up to 60 years. So how long is it going to take before the slurry wall is compromised? What's the average life of the slurry walls? 60 years is something I've heard. It could be longer, 100 years. But the source of contamination is still going to be there. So once the slurry wall is compromised, the source of contamination that's still there is going to start leaching out again. I'm not going to be here. You guys won't be here. My kids, they might be here. My grandkids certainly will be here. I'm worried about that. How long before that source material actually naturally attenuates? So how long is it going to take that cyanide that's sitting there to become harmless? Is it 1,000 years? Maybe 100 years? Do we know that, Carmen, how long that takes?
Depends on initial concentration and all kinds of stuff.
Okay, it depends on initial concentration and all sorts of stuff, but we know that it's highly concentrated. And why can't other remediation options be used right now? I mean, so far we kind of have like a Chinese menu of options. You know, we have chicken chow mein is one option. We have beef lo mein is another option. We have chicken fried rice and beef lo mein. Why can't I have the beef lo mein, the chicken chow mein, the fried rice, right? And the fried wontons all at one time? Why can't we just get that stuff out of there? To me, the cleanup is a business investment. I'm not gonna start preaching on you here, but they made billions of dollars. It's a business investment for them to take that stuff out. We shouldn't have to cover that cost. And I know that EPA has questioned some of this stuff too. In their comments on the Technology Screening Technical Memorandum of May 13, 2020, they provided comments to, I believe it was CFAC and RU, saying that the justification provided to eliminate the source removal alternative entirely is insufficient. So their reasoning for removing that stuff out sounds like it's insufficient. And they also go on to say off-site removal could be screened out, it's too costly. They're saying that, oh yeah, it could be too costly to do. But the removal of waste leach into groundwater remain as the high-end alternative to compare against what is potentially treatment of groundwater in perpetuity. So when I asked how long it's going to take for that source material to naturally attenuate and become harmless, in perpetuity maybe. I mean, EPA realizes this. It's just, you know, when they say it's too costly, it doesn't make sense to me, because leaving the waste in place and building a wall around it is not similar in action to removing that source material. Leaving a cancer in your body or removing it are not similar to me. And so I'm done with that. I'm gonna move on, let Dell go, but I'll entertain a round of questions. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Dell.
Okay. So I discussed how EPA ranks the different alternatives during the last community meeting. The community asked several questions on this issue, so I would like to cover it in more detail tonight. This slide shows the three main groups of criteria looked at when choosing possible alternatives. The section in green shows the threshold criteria. Any alternative that makes its way into the final list of possible alternatives must meet both of these criteria. These threshold criteria are protection of human health and the environment and compliance with all applicable laws. The blue section is the primary balancing criteria. These 5 criteria are given scores based on how well an alternative performs in the 5 listed categories. Scores range from 0 to 20, with 20 being the highest score for any category. The alternative with the highest total score in this section is chosen as the proposed alternative. An engineer scores these 5 alternatives based on how well they perform against the other alternatives in the final list. These scores appear to be subjective. EPA provides the scorer with general guidance on how scoring should be performed, but scoring is based on the opinion of the individual scoring them. An example of this is looking at long-term effectiveness. In EPA's proposed plan, the slurry wall alternative is scored as an 18, and the hazardous waste landfill alternative is scored as a 20. If I were scoring this, the slurry wall would score much lower than a hazardous waste landfill alternative for long-term effectiveness. The last set of criteria used in the gray section is the modifying criteria. These criteria are state and community acceptance. The state has already provided acceptance of the proposed plan. Community acceptance is still being evaluated. So this slide shows the 6 alternatives that made it to EPA's final scoring list. Number 1, no action at the top of the list is only used to compare the other alternatives with it. It is not a possible consideration because it fails to meet the threshold criteria. Of the 6 listed alternatives, EPA scored 4A, the slurry wall alternative, as the highest and is EPA's current proposed alternative. It's shaded in gray. The on-site hazardous waste landfill alternative is shown at the bottom of the list and is labeled as excavation with on-site consolidation. It ranked highest for long-term effectiveness and performance. It ranked the lowest for cost. It is the most protective alternative and has the highest overall cost. You can see here where the scorer gave the slurry wall alternative a score of 18 for long-term effectiveness. Try to point that out here. So right here is long-term effectiveness in this column. This is the preferred alternative, and they scored for being long-term, they gave it an 18 out of possible 20. The hazardous waste landfill alternative was given a score of 20, and that would be in this location right here. So this is the hazardous waste landfill option, and for long-term effectiveness, so they're saying that the slurry wall is near as effective in the long term and permanence as the on-site hazardous waste landfill.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Short-term effectiveness, define short-term.
That is in the following slide, and I will get to that. So,
And
yeah.
the EPA is the one that came up with this assessment model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the blue criteria on the top are utilized in all Superfund sites. That's a standard. And then they have their alternatives that they go through. They looked at a bunch of them, and these were the ones that made it to the very top. So these were the last 6 that were being considered. They all had to meet the threshold criteria for being protective of human health and the environment in compliance with federal regulations, all regulations. They have to meet those criteria, so that's why you see yeses below there. And then the rest of them, the other 5 balancing criteria are scored based on how they compare with the other 6 options, how one alternative compares with any of the others. So you can see how they scored each other. You can see that the off-site removal scored the lowest in cost. They gave it a 0 because it's the most expensive of these 6 options.
Yeah, it seems to me that was designed to get the result that they wanted to get. So that's a crock.
So we were originally told that this kind of formula was very scientifically developed to rank these. But when we went into the research and really dove down deep into it, we found that the 9 criteria are set forth in law, but how they're ranked at each individual site is very subjective, and it's done by the
Individual.
But when you're looking at cost, you get
Oh, yeah.
a cost-benefit analysis of it, and the fact of the matter is, if it's not costing taxpayer dollars, cost is irrelevant. Because in America, you have the opportunity to make a profit, and with that comes a responsibility to deal with the consequences of that profit.
Yeah.
And so you gotta knock that whole category out.
And that's what we're just about to get to. I totally agree. So, let me find where I was here. Short-term effectiveness is weighted equally with long-term effectiveness. Short-term issues are important, but should be given less weight when compared with long-term effectiveness. Where else in our lives do we look at short-term issues equally with long-term issues? It is acceptable to endure short-term difficulty if it provides for a better long-term result in the future, especially into perpetuity. Cost is given equal weight to the other 4 criteria in this chart. Cost should be considered but must be achievable, but should it be given equal weight with the other criteria in this equation? Cost is a burden placed on the responsible parties, Glencore and ARCO. The other criteria apply to how they protect the community and the environment. All of these alternatives are well within the costs that the responsible parties can afford. Lastly, I would like to better cover short-term versus long-term effectiveness. I'll read to you how EPA explains these 2 criteria when determining their scores. Short-term effectiveness considers the amount of time until the remedy effectively protects human health and the environment at the site. It includes an evaluation of adverse effects the remedy may pose to the community, workers, and the environment during its implementation. Possible adverse effects should be evaluated in advance to determine mitigative steps to adequately minimize the impact to the community, workers, and the environment, and minimize any risks that would remain at the site. Institutional controls and other active measures can help mitigate short-term effects and therefore should be considered when analyzing the remedial alternative. And remember that that there's available methods to protect from all these short-term obstacles. So that's the answer to how is short-term effectiveness defined by EPA. How long-term effectiveness and permanence is defined as long-term effectiveness and permanence of an alternative should be viewed along a continuum. Alternatives that are more effective in the long term are more permanent. Our community deserves assurance of this protection now and into the future. Our children are counting on it. Thank you.
So that's the end of our slideshow. Were there any quick questions on this for Dell about the rating system? Way in the far back there.
Short-term effectiveness, what time frame are they talking about when they say short-term effectiveness?
So mostly it's just dealing with the time frame of when the construction is taking place while they're doing the remedy, the alternative.
So can you give me some estimate of the time to do the slurry wall approach versus the time to do
Yes. So the slurry wall, I believe, is estimated to take approximately 2 seasons, possibly 3. And I've read that if it were to be an on-site hazardous waste landfill, that would be upwards of somewhere around 5 years.
How long has it been since this site was active underneath the area? So when did everything get shut down? How long have we been talking about this problem?
2015, right?
2015?
2015 is when it closed, and then they began to, once it was designated a Superfund site, that's what triggered all of these studies that we've been talking about, thousands and thousands of pages of documents. They concluded that in 2020, and they've done no more evaluation of the sites since then. Once the record of decision, and that means that EPA chooses an alternative that they're going to move forward with, and they can modify it, they can add conditions, whatever. But once they reach that final decision, then they begin 2 to 3 years of study on implementing that, and after that time, then they start this construction so we're a long way out from any real resolution here, probably a decade.
So I have a major evaluation category shows 2 years versus maybe 5 years in these two alternatives.
Yep,
And I'm 10 years of studying and analysis before this even gets to a point where we start. Right?
well, to a point where, the remediation has been put into effect.
All I'm saying is it sounds like a time that.
Yeah.
The short-term evaluation doesn't make any sense if it's 10, 20, 30% of the total time it takes them to do this whole process. You can just throw the short-term thing out. It's a worthless assessment.
Thank you. So Shirley, I'm gonna invite Shirley up because we wanna capture some of these comments, like that, and I'm gonna let her explain that process.
I guess this is on, isn't it? Okay.
Move over.
Oh, I'm supposed to be in this video.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So thank you all for hanging in here for an hour and a half. We have about 30 minutes left before we will let you out the door. And we want to hear from you, as Mary just said. So at this point, we want to move into a breakout session so that in a minute, if you would kind of bunch up a little bit, if there's only 1 or 2 or 3 of you at a table, and gather together, and we have a list of questions, breakout questions for each table to respond to. And those questions are: what were the important points raised in tonight's presentations? Where do you need clarification? And what additional information do you want in future presentations? And Dale, those question areas are over on that table. Would you start handing those out to the tables, please? So we'll give you maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes to visit at your table about those, and then we'll come back together and do a report in and write some of those on the flip charts, the old-fashioned word flip chart, and then we'll conclude. So we'll really appreciate your participation with this, and have someone at your table be the recorder to write all of your thoughts down on the paper.